We're in Titus chapter 1. We're picking up in verse 13. For those of you who have not been here, just a reminder of how we got here and what Titus 1 is about. Paul sent Titus, who was probably, we call him youngish, closer to older than Timothy, and therefore probably in his 30s, maybe as old as 40. And they sent him to Crete, which was a difficult situation. He did so to establish two things. He just set things in order that were a problem, essentially, and we'll see some of those things coming up, but also to appoint elders in throughout the different congregations throughout the island. And we talked about what that would have meant. The key element as we went through, beginning in verse 5, is noting that he did not simply give Titus free rein to put anybody in charge or put in these positions that he wanted, but rather he gave qualifications, these various characteristics that he was to examine people, consider them, and to look at their record to see what they were like in character. And it can be actually very healthy rather than just simply making a list between 1 Timothy chapter 3 and here in Titus 1, as we often do. Instead, to recognize that they are the exact same qualifications stated in two different ways. Similar ways, but in different ways. And so when we've looked at these qualifications, it's been in mind to see the way in which it was constructed, to note that the reason why, if a man is blameless, that is then repeated as an essentiality in verse 7. So he states it as a family qualification first, as a general look at things you could see by his family life. Then he went into more specifics of character, but the same qualification of blameless, which has the idea of not being called into question. So the idea is unquestionably qualified here. Each one of these is something to say, these are necessary so that you know as a whole that someone is truly qualified. So in giving the qualifications after the family, you went into the negative things. That he's not going to be like this. So these are evidence of something deeper, that it's a problem that will not go well, will create a problem within the eldership or within the work of an elder. He then added in verse 8, a number of positive characteristics, and we noted how some of the words there are not what you would expect, but that are essential to establish why, in working together as a whole, that you're dealing with someone who is not going to try to dominate the eldership, someone that is good at working with people, and someone that is steady spiritually and is predictable in his faith. So that, verse 9, all of this needs to be true for him to do what is a core component of being an elder, which is both to teach sound doctrine and hold fast the faithful word, and also to correct those instances of where it's not being taught and recognized. Okay? So he closes with that responsibility. And one of the things, whenever you see this, we don't often think about it. We have the qualifications which are about character, and we tend to reduce those into the most physical thing possible, instead of realizing that the physical is there to demonstrate the spiritual, and that everything needs to be spiritual, including the nature of the work. We then looked at how verse 9 implies a level of understanding, so that when we talk about someone who is capable of teaching, it must be someone who is capable of understanding at a higher level, and that they can correct things, and therefore they recognize problems no matter how sneaky the person may be. That requires a high level of knowledge. So last week, we began in verse 10, and we noted the connection between insubordinate here in verse 10 and the family qualification of insubordination of the children, to tie that together, to show that was actually tied in on the idea of their faithfulness doctrinally. So you have, for the children, morally and doctrinally, both need to be in place. But here there are people who are insubordinate, and it describes them as those are of the circumcision, and he says, whose mouths must be stopped because they subvert whole households. Okay, here's the action that must be taken. Here's the type of problem they're causing. They're undermining families, because they're teaching things they ought not. Their motives are partially, at least, money. And then we looked at the quotation from Epimenides on the Cretans in generally, in which we noted that all he's saying is these people who are teaching this kind of stuff, these Jews who are doing this, they're really living up to the Cretan motto. Because they're all in it for themselves, because they're lazy gluttons, they're evil beasts, and they're liars. All three true for people who are teaching false doctrine in this way. They were liars because what they said wasn't true. They are evil beasts because they're out to harm other people. And they're lazy gluttons because they're in it for themselves and what they can get out of it. And then Paul says, this testimony is true. So now we're going to pick up there, and we're going to continue this about what his answer is that was already implied, but now what to do about this problem. So we pick up now in verse 13. Therefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith. Now let's stop there, even though the sentence doesn't, because I want to get the manner of the correction down first before we get into the content. Because that's what he's doing now. Here's how you handle this. You need to rebuke them sharply. Now the word, when you come down and you see the word for rebuke, is, if you go back, it's that same idea that he had mentioned earlier, going all the way to verse 9, to convict those who contradict. So the idea here of convicting is the same as rebuking. Now, to appreciate what that word really, why is it translated with that kind of variety, it has the idea almost in a legal sense or almost in a, a police sense of putting people through almost an interrogation. Let's get to what the real issue is here. Okay? That's partly what's going on. So he says when you are going to rebuke them, it's not some kind of idea of, well, not everyone agrees with that. It is pointed to say, here's the problem, here's what you're saying, and here's why it's wrong. Now, if that were not enough for you, the word sharply is used. Now, does anybody have a different translation of sharply? Severely. Doesn't help us a whole lot, does it? It's a strong word that means, well, it doesn't mean, those are good translations. At its root, the idea is to cut away. So the nature of what you're doing in the investigation, in the rebuking, in the convicting, is you're wanting that person, you're correcting them, and that's the rebuke. The convicting that you're trying to get is to get them to realize that they're wrong. And the effort is to go in and to cut off any error like it's cancer coming out of a body. You don't want to have any left. You take severe action when you recognize that the error is severe. And the idea of sharply is tied back to the idea of cutting. And it is the way we use it in English too, we just don't think about it. So, now when we say that, that's what the manner is. It has to be that this has to be taken that seriously. Now, my question for you is, how do you do that while loving the person at the same time, which is required?
Mm-hmm. Able to cut.
Right.
That's a surgeon term to cut out like cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And here it's basically the same way. Sometimes, to me, okay, when he's sharply rebuked, and like you said,
Mm-hmm.
you can love
Good.
But if you just look down upon them just to make yourself look good because I'm smarter than you and they're not doing this right, and let me tell you how it gets, you know.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right about this. Is that the love needs to be the constant context for everything that you're doing. Okay? In other words, don't think that say, you know I love you at either the beginning or the end, and you try one of those compliment sandwiches that don't work when people haven't ever heard from you or seen your care in any other way. That doesn't work because you are not providing it as context. You're trying to label it love instead of put it in the context of love. And that is the manner needs to be loving and firm at the same time. There needs to be reassurance of the motivation. And that needs to be seen in the way in which you treat them. But yet, with the firmness that this doesn't, I like the fact that you tied that in with how you would correct a child too, because depending upon what the risk is to that child is going to change how you address them. But yet you're going to make sure as best you can that they never doubt the love that's there. Even though it's hard to hear. Is it ever easy to be corrected? No. And if you say, well, yes, it is, say, come up here. I've got some stuff I'll try. Okay, we'll see.
It goes back to the concept of hating the sin and not the sinner. You have to make sure you don't make it personal.
Yeah. That's really hard. I mean, you're right that we need to focus on the sin as the problem, the error is the problem. But how do you do that? You have to see the person themselves as somewhat of a victim, even though they're the one doing it. Okay? Now, can people be fooled? Have you ever been fooled before? Okay, the rest of y'all not nodding your heads or need to come forward for lying next time. Okay. We've all been fooled before by different things, right? So we're not infallible in that way. So we need to be corrected about certain things. We could be so sure in our mind that we had it down and it was right, and we weren't, not at all. Okay, so then when someone points that out, if they do it in a good way, then you're thankful. And, sometimes you can get a real friendship with someone that took the time to correct you, but to love you, and they just want the best for you. That's a key element of what he is doing here, of what's needed in elders. Now, remember, where is this problem coming from? What's going on, if you can envision the situation? What's happening? We're in Crete. There are different congregations. Titus is going on. He's appointing elders at every congregation. Why? Because they got these kind of ideas, because we've got teachers that have been going around that have been infiltrating some of these congregations, or maybe they've just been listening to people and they're repeating what they've been told. That does happen quite a bit. So they think they're right because they trusted who they were listening to. Whether or not, how strongly it is, that's to be determined by the elders trying to make the correction. Now, I want you to note, with that idea of you have to have a focus on why you're doing it, the manner needs to be right, but it needs to be firm and direct instead of trying to think, expect the people to guess why you're there. Okay? Well, we've got a problem, and you sit there, and they're asking 20 questions to try to figure out the problem. No, you should be able to point out, here's what the problem is. Okay? Okay, Bill?
It seems like when Nathan told David, you were it.
You're the man. Yeah. And it got to him, right? But now, and even then, Nathan's a good example, because did he just stand up and say, hey, David, you're the one messed up? No, he got David, actually, by using the parable to where David had to agree in principle first. And then, after David had agreed in principle and understood that that's a horrible thing, now he can say, yeah, you're the one doing it. Because he's already said what ought to happen, right? So he relied on his own judgment. Okay, Steve?
This is what Bill said. This actually happened True, it is. Got up, walked over to the deacon who was causing the problems, went behind, put his hands on his shoulder and says, and here is our problem.
There we go.
And pointed it out in the situation.
Yeah, you can do that,
That's what helped us out.
yes, and it's tough, right? Okay, now notice what he says, though, the purpose. Look at the rest of the verse. I think sometimes we get we like, therefore rebuke them, and we stop. Rebuke them sharply. Oh, I like that. But we don't go and see the rest of it. If you're not rebuking them in the way that you can get to the rest of the verse, you're doing it wrong. Okay? Notice, he says, that they may be sound in the faith. You have a purpose in your rebuke, which is centered on their benefit and what they're teaching. You're trying to correct them so that they'll be right. That's a lot harder to do than simply telling somebody how wrong they are. I can point fingers all the time and tell people that they're wrong if I don't care what happens to them. But the way, if I'm going to be pointing this out to them and why they're wrong and why they need to change, you know what I have to be? I do not have to be just so confident and sure that if I beat the table enough, all of a sudden they'll get the point. I must be persuasive toward the truth. It's essential. So when you talk about what the manner needs to be, it's implied within the end design that we're trying to get people to be sound in the faith. Now, he keeps coming back to that word sound. We've already established what that means, though, right? It's healthy. Okay, healthy in the faith. So he's tied all this down. He's using that in the sense of in their Christianity, which is being used there as a whole of everything that would be taught and believed. So what they believe and what they would be teaching, it needs to be healthy. And that goes back to that idea of some need things to be cut away, because that's not healthy. That's bad stuff you don't want in there. You know, I want you to remember about this, right? Really quick illustration of this. Thou shalt not surely die. That's 5 words, right? 80% of them are true. It's the 20% that's counted by not that's the problem. So when you have stuff, you're trying to cut away the part that's causing the problem. You can't take out the not and say would have had a true statement. Well, you've got to get in and realize where the problem is. But to do this, okay, I'm going to get practical a little bit now. To do this, you have to understand why the person is teaching and believing what they teach and believe. You can't just have a knowledge that you understand that it's wrong. Okay, that's a beginning point. It's an important thing. But you need to see, why did they go down here? What did they believe that led them to this? Now, there can be a lot of things. Sometimes there are simple solutions for this. Sometimes the answer is they believed this because it was convenient, or they wanted to because of their family was involved in this sin, and therefore they decided that it was going to have to be okay with them. Okay? That's a simple way of saying, here's what did it. But sometimes it's actually deep-seated kind of problems, or they got confused, or they were listening to, they had someone they really respected read over here. They were reading something here, and they didn't know enough to know that it was wrong. There are a lot of reasons why, and you need to get down and figure that out. Because otherwise we end up trying to offer simplistic critique of complex problems. You know how many people you'll be able to convince doing that? Practically zero. So we have to be willing to do the hard work if our goal is actually to help them be sound in the faith. Sometimes recognizing that something is not right is the easy part, and trying to figure out what to do to correct it, that's all the hardest part. And that's why being an elder can be so difficult, is you're trying to do all the background work sometime to, well, why do you think that with someone in the congregation? They may have some long history going back for years. Well, you need to find that out and talk them through it, and not simply treat them as if they're stupid or that they are malicious and they've got all these bad motives because they believe something that's not right. Okay? Our goal is for them to be sound in the faith. Treat them as people you want to be sound and you think you can get them there. Let them be the one that keeps them from being sound in the faith, not you just simply, in excising the cancer, decided to cut on the heart and cut the heart of it all out too and kill them. Okay? Sometimes we get busy cutting away and we do damage because we're not precise in trying to cut out the problem. And we cut a lot of healthy tissue too. They need to be sound in the faith. If we're the ones doing some of the damage, then we've made it harder for them to be sound and healthy, correct? Okay. Now, is everyone getting a good picture of the responsibility that this entails? Because that's why I'm going into it at this length. Okay, we don't have time for all of this, but we're going to introduce verse 14. Not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men who turn from the truth. Now that is a negated modal participle. I throw that out to sound smart. Okay. It's designed to say, here's what it takes. Here's the problem that's keeping them from being sound in the faith. Well, what is it? It's twofold. That they are giving heed to Jewish fables, and they are paying attention, which is what giving heed means, to commandments of men who turn from the truth. Okay, so notice two things. They're listening to the wrong sources. Those sources come in two different categories. Men, so others who are false teachers, and their commandments, and literature that is wrong. Everyone got that? Two categories you can be wrong about. We're going to deal with the second one first. Commandments of men who turn from the truth. Now, we've already established, going back to verse 10, that these are mainly people, Jews, those are the circumcision. So there's a Jewish problem, but it has two different characteristics to it. You're starting to see during the 60s, there was this transition of problem. You've got the Judaizing teachers, which is usually the idea of commandments of men, right? And most specifically, if you look just to the verse 15, to that when he's kind of comment there about being pure, that word actually, if you'll circle it, is clean. And if you put clean in a Jewish context, all of a sudden some things start popping up in your head right about what he's talking about. Okay? So if you have there the Jewish context needing to do the things that are clean, and those are the commandments, but the nature of them is these are commandments of men. That's the first part. Men want you to listen to them, those commandments. But the men are characterized as having turned away or turning away from the truth. Now, that would indicate, if they're turning away from the truth, what does that tell you about them? That one time that they knew the truth, right? That they were sound at some point. The idea of the word here is they're turning their backs on truth. Now, if you're Jews going back to previous things you believed as a Jew, is that a hard stretch? Not at all. Not at all. That's one of the, you know how hard it is to get all your old ideas out of you? Those of you who, I'm going to say this first and then I'm going to follow. If you did not grow up in the church, you have a healthy appreciation for how hard it is to try to get out wrong ideas you were taught, right? You know how hard that can be. People who were brought up in the church still have some things they believe that are wrong ideas, but they don't know it. So they have trouble getting those out, okay? They don't recognize it as much. So there's where you've got an advantage sometimes. You know you've got the issue, and some people don't. Okay, so you've got to make sure that you're trying to get those ideas out, okay? He's saying you've got to turn their back on truth. So that says also it means truth is knowable. Now, we take that for granted, but if you could turn your back on the truth, that it was something that you knew you've left, which means it can be known, though. Jesus said in John 8, verse 32, you should know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. It's knowable. It's the one that frees you, and you're turning your back on it, or these people are. Okay? Why? How are they turning their back? Because you're having to choose. Now, let's put this within a nice postmodern context. I mean, after all, these people are religious. How are you? They're just trying to do things that are religious for God, and here you are causing a problem about it. Paul. The fact you say you're doing something for God does not mean he takes it automatically, now does it? And the fact that it's religious alone doesn't make it legitimate. That says that there is a distinction between what is truth and then something can still be religious and not be truth. It can have good motives in looking to God and not be truth. And that's actually more likely to when people will turn away because it's not as far to go. You don't have to travel that far. If you can take an offer that's just a little bit extra over here, you don't have to go all the way to atheism. You used to have to stop right here. You've still turned your back on the truth. That's the problem they were dealing with. Okay? Why? Listening to men. Think about what Jesus said, quoting from Isaiah in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 9, in vain do they worship me, words reverence me, teaching for as doctrine the commandments of men. Okay? So you really have a reference here by Paul, most likely, to the same verse in Isaiah. That you've got the problem. They're not listening anymore to what God says because they're caught up in what men say. Okay. Now, I want to introduce this. We've got to deal with the Jewish fables. What are Jewish fables? How can they be any harm? We've got Aesop's fables.
Wouldn't it be kind of like tradition, stories?
The story, actually, it can be translated as stories. The word is myth, and actually that is a clue. Fiction. Good. Now we're going somewhere. They had this whole thing about the angels and the hierarchy. Okay, Daniel? Yes, and let's expand that even more. And because you see some of it in the Apocrypha, you see a lot of what he's talking about with the idea of fables in the pseudepigrapha, which are a much larger canon of writings. But let's start with the Apocrypha. Okay? One that you see quoted in the New Testament close to the same time period is Enoch. Now, I hope that no one, this is one of those fun things. My students in the first year, for my class, they have the Bible, of course, and those kind of things. You know what book they have to read? Enoch. I'm teaching them Jude. They have to read Enoch. If you will take the trouble to read Enoch, you will understand why and the difference between something that is inspired and something that's ridiculous. Okay? But Enoch and books like it, I posit, were becoming very popular during this time period. Let me explain why I think so. Number one is what you get with Jude, who quotes from Enoch and refers to Enoch in chapter 2, and also quotes from Assumption of Moses. You've got some other things that are possible as well in the general sense of Jubilees as another book. I don't expect you to remember all that or even recognize the references. But when you see that, okay, you have to go back and say, but why? This period of time, when likely Titus was written, was a time in which the Jews were getting even more unhappy with Rome than they had been before. Now, depending upon when we are going to date Titus, okay, it's not at the end, but it's most likely if he's left him there, we're talking probably around 63. In 64, the Jews send a legation to Rome with a series of grievances that they want addressed. Now, in the meantime, if you're unhappy with the government over you, what do you if you think it's a really bad problem, what do? You rebel. Well, and it doesn't start immediately, right? You first got to kind of work people up, and you got to have calls for that. This is not right, and all this. And then you're going to call for independence, right? You agitate. Right? Okay, all those things. But remember, if this was written in 63, we have the Jewish rebellion beginning 3 years because they didn't get what they want when they went in 64. And to say how bad that was, you have to realize how many times they did stuff. Judas in 6 A.D., and then you have actually a big deal with Pilate he just crushed quickly. Well, they know that. But they're going to win this time. And you know why they know they're going to win this time? Because God's on their side. Just like he was with the Maccabees. That was the last successful rebellion the Jews had. Guess what stuff came out of the Maccabean revolt? A lot of this literature. It was after that period of time. Some of it was before, because I would suggest to you, it was the Jewish attempt following in the Hellenization period, when they were conquered when Persia was conquered by the Greeks and the Jews were Hellenized, right? Culture, but they're trying to maintain their monotheism. The Greeks brought all this mythology. In the pseudepigrapha, the Jews developed their own. But this became tied in with that Jewish nationalist feeling of we're our own people. And you have all that coming in, so it's natural. So we have these Jewish fables. We can actually trace back and know what some of them would have been. And they're bringing in both arguments about the law and a return to Judaism. It doesn't go into the motives here. You see some of the motives in 2 Peter and in, you see it in 1 Peter, 2 Peter, Jude, and Hebrews, that they're political motives for going back into Judaism. And these are the early days of that, just on the seed. And using a religious motivation. But Jewish religion was completely tied in with Jewish culture. And that's why they were intertwined. It functioned far more like, it's why people are so confused about Islam. It's a political religion. Well, the Jews function as a political religion in some respects in that time period. And so it was all intertwined. Okay. So I just want to let you know, I'll give you, I'm going to be gone next week because I'm going to be in a couple gospel meetings. So you've got 2 weeks to read the entire pseudepigrapha. 2 volumes, about that big, small print, no problem. But you have 2 weeks if you want to read over a little bit to understand what I'm talking about, what kind of stuff it was, because some of it was the idea of judgment, but it was a judgment on everyone else where God was going to provide his providential judgment on Rome through them. You have to understand the thinking to appreciate the problem.
I was thinking, one of the things you said that I think is so important too is the fact that it's so incredibly easy to take that in littles.
Mm-hmm.
To take that, oh, well, this doesn't hurt anything, it's probably true. It's not like someone walks in and says, oh, we need to start sacrificing bulls and goats up here because that's what they did.
That's in the Bible,
What?
That's right. It's in the Bible.
Well, yeah.
We'll start with a meal offering. That's hard enough for some of us to give.
Subtle, it's hard to recognize. It's dangerous.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, it's very dangerous. It's subtle things.
It's the subtle things. Usually what people don't realize is that the obvious things are not the most problem. The subtle things are the things we let in because we don't recognize them at the time. There's your problem. We've got some kind gentlemen who've already arrived. Let's please bow with me in prayer. In 2 weeks, we'll pick up with verse 15.